Hello, you're listening to Shorthand, a guide to making a short film, a BFI Network and Film Hub Southeast podcast. Whether you're actively making a short film or passively thinking about it, this is a podcast designed to help you on the journey from coming up with a compelling short film idea to editing it into a finished product. Applications for the BFI Network Short Film Fund open on the 14th of March, so by now you might have assembled a team and are starting to think about the elements you need to bring together that application. In this episode, we're going to be talking about one of those all-important elements, the budget. It might not be sexy, but it's necessary. You'll hear from producers about where to begin with building a budget, what kinds of things you need to cost up, and where you might be able to save costs, and how to ensure that the budget is on the screen.
At the beginning of the process of making any short film, I guess I break down the script. So if you're more experienced or you have access to softwares like Movie Magic, budgeting and scheduling, then that might be more of a formal process, but you really don't have to do it in that way. You can just break down a script on your own. So in practice, this is just going through every scene and looking at the elements of that scene. So the way I always think about it is you pull out everything that needs to be created, or where you need to enable somebody else to achieve that, or anything that requires some form of creativity or a practical solution, or any people who are going to be in that scene.
That's Emily Everdee, a BIFA-nominated film producer and founder of Everdee Media. With several short films under her belt, including Mandem, The Call Centre, and Listen to Me Sing, Emily has a fair bit of practice with putting together a budget. Here she discusses where to start, how to break down a script, and why it's crucial to be in conversation with every department to figure out what they need to do their job.
So you're going to look at things like, how long the scene is, therefore how much time it's going to take to film it, which characters are in the scene, whether you need cast members, extras, what's the location and what do you need in that location, what props, etc. And anything else that's a little bit different, so any animals, any special vehicles, any special skills as well. Don't forget anything like stunts, or are there any weapons you would need, for example, an official armourer. Anything that stands out to you, make sure you take a special note of that. And then once you've done that for each scene, you essentially have the scale and the physical requirements of your film. And that's then when I start to put a budget together. So I do that all before I start actually looking at what I need in the budget. And that should then give you some indication of the scale of your movie and how many people you might need to achieve that. So for example, if you've got small film and it all takes place in one location and there's just a couple of characters, then you might not need such a big AD team. You might be able to cut it down, for example, to a first AD and then someone covering the role of a second and a third, as long as the first is comfortable with that. And you might also not need multiple assistants for costume and makeup because there's a limited cast. And also, if you're limited to one or two smaller locations, then your production team and drivers, for instance, might not need to be as big. So that's really how I start, just by taking the script and looking at all the practical elements in that. Once you have your HODs on board, I would just go back through each head of department and talk to them in detail about what they and their team would need to achieve their job. Because very often as a producer, you're not a specialist, you're more of a generalist in terms of all of the other roles on the film. So you have to have a really good understanding of every role, but you are never going to have as great an understanding as that head of department. So I have a conversation with all the heads of department that I have on board at the time of budgeting and take them through their job. And then I make sure that I'm applying that to the budget. In terms of getting other people's input and approval over the budget, I would be careful not to ever give a director-specific approval unless they also were serving as an executive producer and helping to finance the film, in which case they have a producing role on the film. But I would make sure that I'm always having discussions about different solutions and ways of getting the most out of the money that we have in order to achieve the scenes in question. So while I wouldn't necessarily always give the director and heads of department full access to my budget, I would talk them through the elements of the budget that apply to them. And also I'd be very open and honest about where the limitations are, where we might be able to push things and get a little bit more money for that area or more out of our money and do deals, for example, and just really share openly the context and the situation that we're in without necessarily presenting the numbers. The reason for this is that ultimately, in the same way that you're not an expert in, cinematography or costume design, nobody else is an expert in producing. And so your job is to balance the distribution of the budget according to the needs of that specific film. But what I would do is always make sure that I'm having a really good in-depth conversation with each head of department and making sure that I understand their needs and that they feel listened to. And then I might go away and reassess how I've distributed my budget and move things around from one line into the other based on what I've learned. I think one of the things that a lot of crew can feel most frustrated by sometimes is that their needs haven't been taken into account, or nobody's been thinking in detail about how they can practically achieve what they need to achieve creatively on the budget that they have. And so there's a few things that I do to try and establish really great lines of communication from as early as possible. The first thing is that when I'm actually recruiting, when I am crewing the film, I always give as much information as I possibly have to that person, even if it might be the kind of information that you feel like holding back. For instance, we have a tiny budget and our fees aren't what you're going to be used to, or we don't have massive floats for each department, or we can't provide X, Y, or Z. It's far better to give that information right from the start, to be really open with the context of the project, why the budget's limited if it is, and what sort of contribution you're looking for from that role. I find that when you do that, that then gives people the opportunity to turn down or accept that role based on those terms. And crew often feel more trusting of you because you've given them more information right from the beginning. And then what I do is, when I have confirmed a head of department, I will have a one-to-one conversation with them, just them and me as the producer, which isn't so much the creative conversations that we would have with the director or that they might have directly with the director. It's more of a, okay, here's the role, here's the budget, here are my plans logistically. What are your questions? What are your needs? And I have created this exercise for myself where I effectively walk myself through the experience of that HOD in my own head. So I think, what am I asking them to create or to achieve? Where will they be prepping? How will they get there? Where will they park? What will they need to have there? For example, equipment. Where will that be stored after they finish prepping? Who else might they need to help them? What will they eat and drink when they're there? And then how much prep time and strike time do they need on location itself? What will be required of them on the day? And, what is the end product that person's trying to achieve? I find that really helps you to spot in advance some of the niggling challenges that can often come up in short filmmaking at the last minute, when you get a call from, the costume designer saying, well, how am I supposed to get 5 suitcases of clothes to that location? I don't have a car that's big enough, or something similar to that. And then after I've done that, I'll have that one-on-one conversation with the HOD. We'll talk about some of the bigger challenges for that person on the budget that we have and come up with solutions together. And once you open that line of communication right in the beginning of the process, I find that they come to you more often and express how they're doing, what's going well, what the challenges are that have come up, so that you're not then shocked at the last minute by things that you didn't realize were perhaps going wrong or weren't quite being achieved.
Next up, Emily offers some tips for staying on budget and what other, perhaps more surprising things you should be budgeting for.
One of the consequences of things cropping up last minute is that it can eat into your budget. And if you're not careful, it could force you to tip over budget. And something that I will always say to new producers is, make sure that you don't tell yourself you can spend contingency before you get to the shoot. So contingency should be really, if you have a contingency line in your budget, which might be on some projects 10%, on some maybe 5 to 10% of your overall budget, you really should consider that for things that crop up in the future that you can't imagine now are going to go wrong, and that happen either on the shoot or in post-production, or maybe just in those last couple of days where you're prepping and everything's a bit mad. But if you are already thinking a few weeks before the shoot, well, that's probably going to need more money, then I would do the work now to try and shuffle budget around, find ways to save money in other areas, to try and come up with some ingenious solution of getting a better deal or doing something a different way. Have conversations with crew members that might be able to help you find those solutions, and free up that money for that thing that you already have a feeling is going to go over, rather than just dipping into your contingency because it seems like it's free money there available to you. On a short film, if you're going to go over budget, you're in quite a different position to if you're on, say, a big feature film or a studio film, because very often those are being run by companies that have quite a lot of money and that may be able to just find a bit more money for you. But very often on a short film, that's not the case. The budget that you've got is the budget that you have. So it's especially important that you really think your way through, like I said, the experience of everybody who's contributing to your film, and make sure that you're communicating regularly with the director so that they have expectations that are in line with what you can achieve for them, and that you're both going to be really happy with the end result. Because if you do come to going over budget, then that's when you have to either make cuts in other areas that you weren't planning to make, or maybe raise a bit more money in post. When it comes to costs of marketing and distribution, for example, applying to festivals, if I'm completely honest, that is often the thing that comes out of the budget when you're trying to make cuts. If you are required to fit your budget to a certain amount for an application, or you've been given a grant of a certain figure, sometimes it can be difficult to carve out money for distribution and festivals because you do feel like your priority is getting the film made. And that makes sense. But if you can include a bit of money for at least festival entry, and a bit of money for example, a poster design that's going to be really eye-catching, it can do a world of wonders for your film, because ultimately what you want is for audiences to see that film. But I would say that the average festival, the average, say, BAFTA qualifying or Oscar qualifying festival, which is often a marker of one of the more established festivals, would be between £10 and £15 up to, £60, £70 entry. So if you are going to apply to a handful of festivals or more, you're probably going to need at least a few £100s for that. But this is also something that you can definitely raise more money for in post-production through crowdfunding, using the resources that you now have from your film, if you don't manage to fit that into your initial budget. Sometimes I think some of the most challenging things to budget for are some of the elements that are newer for producers and that we have started to take into account in the last few years. One of the things you might want to think about is sustainability on production, and how, as a film industry, what our carbon footprint is. And on a short film, this doesn't need to be as complicated and as scary a topic as you might imagine. I would recommend going onto the BAFTA Albert website. You can get some free training from BAFTA Albert talking about how, the industry impacts on the planet, and looking at some production case studies. And you can also then get a carbon calculator to work out what your specific short film's footprint would be. And if you manage to, you can also pop a little bit of budget in there towards offsetting the carbon footprint of your film. And BAFTA Albert can help you do that. So you make a contribution to them, and then they make a contribution to causes and charities that help with that. You also need to obviously think about the COVID situation at the time of filming and what your COVID protocols are going to be. And very often, especially if you have actors who are going to be acting in close contact unmasked, you'd want to account for some testing costs. And the best advice I can give for getting a sense of what's appropriate at the current time of your shoot is to speak to First Option Limited if you can, or another health and safety organisation who are really up on the latest information on COVID and the testing that is recommended, because it does really change as the COVID situation changes. All in all, what you need to do if you have budget elements and you just don't know how much it's going to cost or exactly what's required, give a call to anybody that you can who's a specialist in that area. You would be amazed how open people are to actually talking you through their services and what the costs are. And if you're open with them about the scale of your film and that you're still learning, very often people are very generous with their quotes as well.
How do you eat an elephant? One piece at a time is very much the way of going about it. Are you in a city, or are you in the beach? Are you in the mountains? You break the script down into sections, traditionally called eights, and how many eights can you shoot in a day? You may be looking at shooting three pages a day, and that also depends on how many unit moves you've got. So when you've got your locations, your cast members, you can then look to build the budget around that. And at the beginning, it will be a very kind of, it's a completely, it's a movable feast, the budget, and it will be changing from the day you start till the day you finish. And I think you've just got to be wary of that.
That's Romain, a film producer whose credits include animation shorts such as Oh Black Hole and Soft Animals, as well as live action projects such as Cowboy and White Girl. Here he's talking about what it takes to build a budget, where you find quotes, what you should be paying people, and why a budget isn't a fixed entity, but rather something that you adjust and amend.
Working out how much things should cost on a short is incredibly difficult. You're starting off from the fact that you're hoping people are doing it for the love rather from the money, and that everyone's aware of that when you start. So you've got people and you've got locations and you've got kit. It's super important that you pay everyone, and from there your starting point is minimum wage for most of your crew. And then you may be, personally, I've identified maybe an HOD buyout, head of department buyout rate, where they're all on the same amount of money. Then it's just clearer for you in your head when you're dealing with things. And then actors are on equity minimum, and that's clear, and there's no deviation from that. It's likely there's never any income that comes from this film, which does make things, I guess, slightly easier at this point, that you've got nothing to share out in the future. So that's how it comes to crew. As I said, it's really important that you pay people. Maybe as a possibility, if you're working with students where the experience is beneficial, that you may be able to work with volunteers. And I've done that, and they're an amazing energy and lifeblood to the set, and it was brilliant to work with them. In terms of kit, that's harder. You need to work out. Sometimes you might want to speak to your DOP early on to work out what they need, and hope and pray that they have relationships with kit houses. Ultimately, lots of people would rather be making short films creatively than adverts or more commercial work. So there might be deals that you can do if people have got other relationships. And then locations are always tricky. I just suggest putting numbers in the budget early on and just working towards them. And then you've also got to be aware of, if you're filming outside, you should probably, I'm not saying you people will do this, but you should probably ring up the borough and find out. They've all got, they're all film savvy, and there's film councils, and ring them up and find out how you film there and what the costs are. But initially it's about putting numbers down in the budget, which you can then kind of tailor and amend as you go along.
In the next segment, you'll hear Jessie discuss setting up a production company, how you decide who you need on set, how to save money on a film, and why the key to a happy set is making sure people know what their jobs are and what they're responsible for before filming starts, and how involved the director should be in budget conversations.
The first thing one probably needs to do when you're going for BFI funding, and you can change it as you go, so it doesn't have to be for the actual initial funding round, but if you were to get funding, you need to know quite early as whether you're going to make the film through as an individual or as a limited company. There's pros and cons of both. Setting up a limited company is not hard. It's through Companies House, and anyone can do it. Although once you have a limited company, you have to do accounts, which have costs and complications. But you are protected as a limited company, that should anything go wrong, then it's not your liability, which I think helps me sleep at night when there's lots of other things rolling around in your head. And then again, when you're a limited company, then you can consider the tax credit. I would think that it's worth thinking about that. If you're making a film for 15 or grand, then you're looking at possibility of 2 or 3 back. You make a film for 18 and it's actually 15. That makes sense, because 2 or 3 of that, it comes from the tax credit. But you need to spend money on accountants to make that happen. Some people have done it themselves, but it does sound complicated. I haven't actually got to that stage yet. I'm just doing it with a film I'm making. If you're saying that there's 3 grand that you're going to get from tax credit, then you need to show where you're going to get that from, because you don't get it back till after you've made the film. So first of all, coming back to that, I'd recommend setting up a limited company. And then when you get funding, before the BFI give you any money, you need to have insurance. And that is money you'll have to put that out yourself to get insurance. And that's about ringing around. They've got a list of brokers on their site, and you ring them and you tell them what you're planning to do, what the budget is and how many days shoot, and they'll insure you for longer. It's something that goes on for longer because there's different elements that are being insured, and you'll need that insurance again to hire any kit. The kit houses are likely to say, to need a certain level of insurances for what they hire. defining the parameters of who you need on set is incredibly tricky and will depend massively from one set to the other. If you've got a lot of cast, you'll probably need a second AD, but it might be that you can do without. If you're shooting outdoors, you won't have a lot of light set up, so you probably won't need the same amount of sparks or technical crew, which will make shooting a lot quicker and easier, but will bring with it its own problems. If you're shooting inside, with lights, you'll probably need sparks, and if you've got one spark, you probably need two, because there's carrying and lifting and all of that that's going on. If you've got children, then you've got to check the licensing laws on this, but there's different ages, you'll need a chaperone, and then you'll need a space for the child as well when they're in downtime. So these are kind of all things to consider. Runners wise, you just need you need someone on the base to look after the teas and coffees, because if you don't, then they'll go everywhere. And I personally have worked with, I've been fortunate to have production managers which have been great, because you just can't be everywhere as a producer, and you want to be creative producing as much as possible, although invariably you'll probably be locking up at the end and doing the bins and everything else. How to save money on a film is a really tricky question. People have been making films for a long time, and the roles are quite clearly identified for a reason. You need everyone on a set, but if you are making a short with a small crew, do you need everyone? I mean, can you get by without a DIT, without a script supervisor, without the actors doing their own makeup? Will someone do stills for you? If you are going to try and avoid, go without some of these roles, who are all super important in their own way, I think it's important to just let everyone know what the situation is. And if you're not having a script supervisor, which we went without on my last short, is a director aware, and are they happy? Because something will fall on them, and luckily the director was brilliant, and that wasn't a problem. If you aren't going to use a DIT, are the camera team okay with that? I think there are ways you can save. And then on the day when you're shooting, catering can be incredibly expensive. Is there someone within your production team? I wouldn't recommend. I mean, there's obviously health and safety implications, so I've got to be careful. But we have catered, and it has been more successful than not. So it's just having the plan, and just talking with people, and making sure people are aware what their jobs are going to be before they start. Because the main thing you want, and the most efficient filming, is having a happy set with people who are well fed and know what they're doing. Bringing the director in with the budget and their vision is hugely important. Again, they should know what the limitations are in terms of what they're trying to make. And I think there's very likely in the kind of the BFI shorts that we're talking about here, it's quite possible the director isn't being paid. So they might well be, but it's very hard to finance the film with on that level. So they'll be kind of aware of the budget. And then it's just about trying to make sure that you work with them to give them the confidence that you trust them and you want to give them what they want, but also so they know if they want, if they want a sunset scene and a sunrise scene, that's just not going to work in a 3-day shoot. And so they've got to pick one, and it's about picking kind of the hero shot that defines the world and working with it. But you don't want to be no. You don't want to be that producer. But at the same time, they've got to be aware there's got to be some give, and they can't have everything.
Finally, Jesse speaks to the differences between budgets for animation and live action, and his tips for filmmakers on putting together a workable budget that gives everyone what they need.
There's quite a few differences between live action and animation. There's less inputs into animation than there are live action, and you're not going to be dealing with kind of as many complications of crew, and scheduling a day isn't going to be the same. In a live action, you've got quite a stressful couple of days shoot where you've got to get everything in, and you're beholden to the weather or these things which don't exist in animation. But budgeting for animation, again, it starts with the schedule. You can need to break it down again bit by bit to work out what you're going to achieve, and it's slightly different between 2D and stop motion. And also one key thing, and I think is in animation, you want to get to an animatic quite quickly, because an animatic is like it's a storyboard essentially, which shows your film. A script doesn't quite do justice for an animation. Well, depending on what your animation is. If it's a normal house in a normal world, then the script is fine, but an animation can go to much far off places than that. So it's nice to have that. And then working out how many seconds of work per day your animator can do and how much support they need and how much, what their rates are, will then feed into the budget. I guess the big cost in animation, which you haven't got in live action, is you might need a studio space where your animator works. And an animation is kind of the opposite of a documentary, whereby a documentary, it's likely that you may form the film in the edit at the end, whereas in an animation, it's important to form the film in the edit at the beginning, so you don't have to reanimate or go back. But the approaches at the beginning, I think, are very similar to that of live action, of just breaking it all down and trying to understand what each individual element will cost. As I said, with that live action, you might learn as you go that some things are going to be over or some things are going to be under, but if you put numbers down to start with, you'll get there. It's just to be fully aware of your budget is the most important thing. You want to have some fat in it, maybe, so that you've got some things to play with. But you don't want to have a film have money left at the end. And that's not great either. But again, you don't want to go over. So it's about knowing your budget, being aware of it. There'll be some things which will happen cheaper than you expected to happen, but there will probably be more things which happen at greater cost than you expect to happen. If you do get to the stage of, if you're running late on a day, have a thought to yourself about whether you can afford overtime. It's probably likely that you can't. And if you can't afford overtime, how are you going to deal with that the next day? If it's the last day, maybe there's some different thoughts in your head. There's a real difficult balance between saving wherever possible and then also keeping everyone happy and making sure everything works. The key thing really is to haggle before you get to set, get the best deals before you get to set, and get everything for the best price with the good team, and then make everyone feel you've got 3 days or 4 days and everything's got to run as smoothly as possible, and everyone's got to be happy, and some things you can't save on.
So your relationship with the director is the most important one. It's such a partnership. You both want to know that you're setting out to make the same film. Like, there has to be trust there. And that also filters into transparency on the film's budget. Like, they don't need to know the inner workings of your budget purely because, they should be focusing on their own craft. But I'm always happy to talk budget with a director. I think it's helpful to have that transparency over it because they need to know what we can achieve really, and how to maximize the budget that we do have. I try to encourage the directors to leave the negotiating to the producer and to not talk money, as it can sometimes complicate the relationship with their creative partners. And I would rather have those difficult conversations.
That's Cheri Darbon, a film producer whose credits include short films such as Sensational Simi, For Love, Bufflehead, and as executive producer, the BFI Network and Film Hub Southeast backed The Last Days. Here she's discussing how to navigate budget conversations with a director and how to ensure that your budget is on the screen and what that even means.
With directors, I suppose it's ensuring that you're constantly communicating and that they don't feel any type of way if they want to raise a concern or they're trying to reach for the stars. Join them, have a look at the stars. You should have the conversation and then work out what's possible. If your director is coming to you and you say no immediately, you've left no room for exploration. Everyone wants to make it work as well, and you never want to be the person to say no. I would always say to not say no straight away, because you might find that actually after a conversation that there is a happy medium there, or that something is possible. I found actually a lot of the time those people, for instance, with the most expensive equipment are those who actually probably have the most money and the most time to be able to then give you their equipment or operate it for you for a discounted price. And so it depends on the relationships of everything. So I think a constant kind of communication and making sure that you're both set out to make the same film and have the same intentions. I always find that question quite interesting about trying to ensure that your budget is on the screen. So when the audience can watch it, they feel it's like the production have spent their money well. I suppose it's a bit of a balance, really. You don't get caught up in prioritizing expensive camera gear if you haven't nailed the location, or if it's going to take half a day just to travel to your next location, there's a lot of empty time that you're paying that isn't shown on the screen. So I suppose it's making sure that that empty time is used to the best of your ability as well. So if, for instance, your setup is quite intricate, make sure you put in prep days and that you've not got the actor there for half a day waiting around, and then only when the afternoon comes in are they able to come onto set. You won't have a happy set after that either. And that's what's on screen, your talent as well. So I think it's making sure that everything that you're doing and those empty spaces is all serving to the screen and to everything that, and to the story and what you're showing the audience in the end.
Next up, Cheri discusses some roles that you might not initially factor into your budget, but depending on the story you're telling, could be well worth considering and setting some money aside for, as well as her tips for stretching that budget creatively.
I think it's easy to become really practical with budgets, especially shorts. There's like so much to deliver and it adds up so quickly. But I think depending on the script nowadays, I really try to consider the benefits of a wellbeing practitioner. So we recently, on a short I did last year, worked with Lou Platt. And she had also previously worked with Michaela on I May Destroy You. She came onto Script Evals, I think mainly because it had quite delicate topics. And so with our director, it was a very personal story of hers. And so it created a lovely moment for them to be able to talk and go through exactly what it is that she was bringing up and essentially the trauma. And so I think it's really, really important actually, especially as a producer, to kind of create that safe space for the director. But not only that, she offered one-to-ones, she also offered like group therapy almost. It was a moment or a chance to have the crew all at the start of the production get together and just chat about the script and actually like the characters and topics and everything that they felt was relatable to them. Because a lot of the time when you're working in shorts, you're doing it for things that you love as well. And so for the most part, you want to be able to connect. So when you have quite sensitive issues that you want to talk about as a filmmaker, it extends to your gaffer, it extends to your art department, like everyone who's coming onto the set, you want to make sure you've created a safe space as possible. I also think along the same lines, an intimacy coordinator, like movement coaches, in a similar vein as well, of just making everyone feel like they're in that same safe space. That's something that we're doing more and more of, and definitely bringing that same practice from television and features into shorts and making sure that that's across the board for all of our work. And we know to continue that in our next endeavours. So I would say those are probably two things that I would suggest as something you might not consider first of all, especially if you're a new producer. And then there's the mundane things like cleaners. I actually found it really helpful to put a little bit of dollar aside for a cleaner, because sometimes you are moving from one set to the next and you don't have the luxury of a location manager. So it's helpful sometimes to not round up your poor coordinators and directors and DOPs, where you end up sweeping the floors of a restaurant or scrubbing at windows and desks and that. So I think it's a small thing, but a very helpful time and energy saver. Giving yourself little pockets of money secretly in your budget. So if you've got drives already at home and you know that you can use them, but BBC are giving you a bit of money for some drives, put them in, because there'll always be time where, you know, you might find that you actually do need the drives in the end, or you want to use it for a makeup box or something different. You kind of can put that budget in knowing that you can move it and shift it around constantly. And they know that as well, especially the networks and channels, because that is what you're doing when you're a producer and you own a budget. You're kind of moving it around constantly. So I think giving yourself that extra buffer and allowing space in your budgets to just to have a little breather, like a little room around, so you can kind of shuffle things as and when you need to. And also with your heads of departments, so your art directors and your costume, just allowing them a certain amount of the budget that you've put in for them. And then you've got a bit of an overhead there for yourself in case they do go over, because it does happen a lot. And I think creators think that we're holding money away from them on purpose, but it's literally our job to make sure that we have that buffer there. I think the most resourceful way probably is just to reuse and borrow, especially in shorts. I think we're just a little community out there just trying to do our best, and there's 1,000,001 shorts going on at the same time, to be honest. And so you'll actually find that people will have leftovers, and you can do call outs and ask if anyone's got spare trestle tables or chairs or urns, and those little things that are really, really helpful, but you don't necessarily have to spend loads of money on them to be able to have them on your set. There's just loads of productions around who might be wrapping up, and they might be able to give them to you or lend them to you even. Lots of shorts are filmed at the weekend, and so you might be able to use another productions, if it's allowed, take that onto your set. So I'd say kind of reusing as much as possible as well, in terms of like, we bought printers before, so just keeping hold of those and taking them back on set when you need them again. It's also it's resourceful, and it's like environmentally friendly.
And finally, Cheri talks about why you shouldn't be afraid of the budget or spreadsheets, and how you can gain confidence if you're putting together your very first budget.
Those who suck at maths, like myself, Excel is your friend. Like, she is your best friend. She's just there to help you along your way. So don't be scared of it, and just kind of get stuck in with her straight away. Get a good budget template, whether that's from another producer, and cost report and stuff, and just play around with it. It's really satisfying to like get your head into there. And I always really like it when I'm like, oh, like I know this budget inside out. I know exactly what numbers are where and how it works. And I would say to always double check your formulas match up, because that is just a very easy but often overlooked mistake, where you've just not connected the right formulas together, and so it's not actually adding up to what you spent or what you need to spend, and so you can find yourself at a bit of a loss for money. I'd probably say have another person check your budget as well. I always like to work with co-producers or my production managers, be really close with me on the budget too, so that they can triple check things. And also just in terms of like when we were speaking earlier about what would you put into a budget that might surprise others, like just getting their take on it as well, and being like, oh, you've missed out like a DIT, you've forgotten to put in petty cash. There's like, let's think about locations more, we probably need more for petrol or parking. And I would probably say the only other thing would be for new producers who aren't, let's say, VAT registered or don't have a limited company, that to make sure that you think about the extra VAT that's added onto everything that will be quoted to you. So bear that in mind, because you don't want to come to the end of your shoot and be left with 20% extra to pay than you thought you were going to pay.
Thank you for listening to Shorthand. Look out for a new episode next week that will focus on casting and what you need to know about embarking on that process. Thank you to our guests this week, Emily Everdee, Romain, and Cheri Darbon. Shorthand is a BFI Network and Film Hub Southeast podcast produced by Nicole Davis with support from the BFI Network and ICO team. Special thanks to our editor Graciela May Chico and Epidemic for the music.